In the name of the one holy and living God. Amen.
Amen.
Our gospel reading this morning tells the story of the disciples on the road to Jerusalem. And they're arguing about who is the greatest. And they're doing this right after Jesus had told them for the second time that he will suffer and be killed and rise again. You'll remember from last week that the first time Jesus told them what was in store for him, Peter rebuked him. But Jesus, knowing the mission he had to fulfill, called Peter out, saying, "Get behind me, Satan." Now, Jesus tells them again that he will suffer and die and rise again on the third day. But the disciples don't understand what he's saying. And they were afraid to ask. Maybe they were afraid because of the tongue lashing that Peter had gotten earlier on the trip. Or maybe the whole thing was just completely over their heads. Or maybe they just didn't want to know. In any case, as they walk along, they start jockeying for position. It's the kind of political posturing that happens in many organizations, and they argue about who's the greatest. Now you have to ask, on what basis were the disciples judging themselves? What were their criteria for greatness? Was it who had the most distinguished family lineage? Or who had done the most exorcisms? Or who had the most insightful Torah interpretation? Well, you can see how ridiculous this sounds. But whatever they were saying to each other the whole time, Jesus was overhearing their conversation, and I imagine shaking his head. Didn't they realize that just by engaging in this dispute about who is the greatest, they had already lost the title? And when they finally get to where they're going, Jesus sits down to teach. And the disciples, who are too embarrassed to admit what they had been talking about, listen silently. This time, Jesus doesn't yell at them. He explains that as his followers, they are called to servant leadership. Leadership that puts the well-being of others ahead of their own interests. You can almost hear the egos deflating as they begin to see what this call is really about. It's easy to sneer at the disciples from our perspective 2,000 years later, because we know how the story ends. We know the miraculous, life-giving outcome of Jesus' hideous suffering and death, an outcome that would have been unfathomable to the disciples at this point on their journey. But we shouldn't be too hard on them. They're not so different from ourselves. There are so many arenas in life where we compete with each other, where there are winners and losers, and where people are ranked according to their accomplishments. We rank CEOs according to who gets the largest pay package. We assess employees according to their productivity. We keep detailed statistics on athletes, keeping track not only of points scored, but errors made. We even judge artists, musicians, and actors on their performances in glittering ceremonies that bestow Oscars and Emmys and Tonys and Grammys. We seem to always want to know who is the greatest? And it got me wondering, what if, instead of the commandments to love God and love our neighbor, the church had inherited its teaching from those bickering disciples? What would a church focused on who is the greatest look like? Well, here at St. Bart's, we might start by awarding annual prizes, like most enthusiastic greeter, or most meticulous altar guild member, or outstanding achievement in church attendance, with a special mention for the people who go to the 8 a.m. service. There would also be awards for clergy, dare I say, like, God forbid, best preacher. Now, this might be fun at first, especially if you win. But eventually, though, I suspect we might all be so focused on winning one of those prizes, vying for position and prestige, that Jesus would slowly fade into the background and eventually disappear entirely. Well, thanks be to God, there is no such thing as church Oscars, but just the thought of this absurd idea throws into stark relief how the church and her members are, or should be, different from the world. We're not here because we are vying to be the greatest. We are here because we are trying our best to follow Jesus. If you really want to know what it looks like to model an ideology on those bickering disciples, you will find it in Christian nationalism. Theologian and activist Aubrey Hendricks has called it Christo-nationalism, distancing the movement from the Christianity they claim to represent. Hendricks says, and I'm quoting, "Christo-nationalists lift themselves up and their own needs and their ideology above the biblical narrative itself. They define their notion of Christ, they refract it through their own interests and their own desires. We might call it anti-Christianity because it's the antithesis of what the gospel calls for." Hendricks says, "The threat of Christian nationalism is that it takes the teachings of Christ out of Christianity. It treats them like they're not even important. It's a supremacist movement that's fueled by the rabid desire to dominate, and it thrives on hatred and chaos. And the other part of the threat is that it's turning off many, many people who believe that that's what Christianity is about. When people put their own interests ahead of the gospel, when people elevate themselves above God or ignore God entirely, that is called idolatry. And Christian nationalism is an extreme example of this. A hateful, dangerous ideology that denies the fundamental message of Jesus. And it poisons and corrupts Christianity from the inside. That is why we must always return to God. Return to God and Christ. Draw near to God and the teachings of Jesus, who said, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." It isn't so much about relinquishing power as it is about using whatever power we have for the benefit of others, and not just for ourselves. The bickering disciples may have been the first, but they certainly weren't the last members of the church who got into a power struggle. It happened often in the early church, understandably, as people from different backgrounds came together and tried to figure out how to live together as followers of Jesus. That's what the letter of James is about. Addressed to diverse churches across the Mediterranean, the letter offers ethical and moral guidelines on how church communities can live together in a life-giving way. James writes that anger, deceit, arrogance, and envy are at the heart of the evils that can poison a community, and if left unchecked, can turn violent. In the passage we hear today, he puts his finger on the root of the problem. Those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you? You want something and you do not have it, so you commit murder. And you covet something and cannot obtain it, so you engage in disputes and conflicts. James makes a direct and immediate connection between not getting something we want and murder. A few years ago, I would have thought that was a far-fetched idea. Today, I can believe it. Now, we can all fall prey to arrogance and ambition and self-aggrandizement from time to time. We all want to get ahead. We all want our families to flourish. It feels good to be a winner, and it feels pretty lousy when we lose. But the way of life that Jesus calls us to is one of self-sacrifice, of loving God, of working for the common good and striving for justice. And strange as it seems, when we do those things, we are all winners. As long as we remember why we're here and in whose name we serve, that we're doing all of these things in the service of something larger than ourselves. Draw near to God, and God will draw near to you, writes James. Share the gospel message. Don't be shy. The world really needs to hear it right now. Show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness born of wisdom. Who is the greatest? God is the greatest. And because of that, everyone flourishes and everyone is loved. Amen.